Welcome to the Parent Doctor podcast, where adults who are parents come to learn, lead with love, and grow. Hello, and welcome back to the Parent Doctor podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Marissa Caudill. Today is Season 1, Episode 8, and I'm going to be talking to you about trauma. Welcome. If you are just joining me, thank you for coming. Please rate and subscribe to the podcast to help it go up the rankings. I am the Parent Doctor. I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist and mom of 2, and I've created the Parent Doctor podcast to provide a place and space for parents to be able to learn about childhood mental health issues, but more than that, to help parents understand how they can best support their kids' development in order to reduce the risk of their kids developing problems like depression and anxiety in their teen years. So I've talked so far about a number of issues. In Season 1, my goal was to talk about the top 10 reasons parents over the last 17 years that I've been in practice have brought their kids to see me about. And we've talked so far about depression, anxiety, substance use, autism, ADHD, and today I'm talking about trauma. All right, if you haven't already, thank you for being here, but please subscribe and rate this podcast to help it move up the rankings. That helps me to get out there and be heard by more people. I know there's a need among parents to get good information from someone like a child psychiatrist who knows a lot about things that kids are facing these days, and I want to be able to reach as many people as possible, so thank you very much for rating and subscribing. I also want to encourage you, if you haven't already, to go to my website. That's theparentdoctor.com. Sign up for my weekly newsletter. It's totally free, as well as my monthly book club, also totally free. And you don't have to read the books. That's the best part. I present a book each month of the year related to parenting, and I give you an actionable PDF and access to the replay if you can't make the live Zoom call. This month, June 2024, I'm going to be presenting Dr. Dan Siegel's book, Brainstorm. This is all about adolescent brain development. It's a fabulous book. If you have kids, you definitely need to read this book because it will help you understand the neurobiology of your adolescent's brain and the things that they are going through, and give you ideas on how to communicate with your kid in a way that will help you understand each other better during this time and weather the inevitable bumps in the road that are going to come as your kids enter adolescence. Now, obviously, trauma can be a triggering topic. If you yourself have gone through trauma, then just the mere mention of trauma can make you feel something, right? And I want us to be a bit desensitized to this because I think it's good, right? We have this modern pendulum swing towards understanding of mental illness and compassion of mental health issues, which is good. But I think the downside is that there is sometimes an over-identification with certain common mental health issues, such as having experienced a trauma. The truth is that the vast majority of people in their lifetime will experience some kind of traumatic event. Now, you can argue whether one is more traumatic than another, but basically if we're talking about an experience which someone feels was life-threatening or dangerous or made them feel helpless, then the vast majority of people will experience such a trauma, especially women. The risk for women is much higher than for men. All right, so I want you to recognize something that I've said before, which is that our brain's job is to help us survive. Our brains are wired to keep us alive. That is its primary job. Our brains aren't wired to make us happy or to make us smart. Our brains are wired to keep us alive so that we can procreate and pass on our genes. So the things that our brain does best is to help us survive. So you can therefore understand that a traumatic event that happens, anything that happens with significant emotional valence, especially, but that makes us feel threatened or like our survival might be in danger, that is going to lead to significant learning. Neurons that fire together wire together. And if you have an experience where in a certain situation, you had a negative experience where you felt threatened, those neurons are going to be firing together very strongly and wiring together very strongly. The vast majority of people are going to weather that fine and not experience anything on the other side that's too horrible. But for some people, a small percentage, probably between 5 and 15%, who go through a life-threatening trauma, they will experience recurrent symptoms that last for more than a month after that trauma. Now, anytime you go through a trauma, like let's say you have a car accident or something bad happens to you or a medical scare, it is very common and normal in the few weeks after that to have nightmares, to have times when you feel panicked, to feel on edge. All of those things are normal. But if this lasts for longer than a month, and if it becomes significantly debilitating, then that's when we would really consider it a mental illness called PTSD. It's estimated that 1 in 11 people in their lifetime will be diagnosed with PTSD. And as I said before, women are twice as likely as men to be diagnosed with PTSD. In addition, 3 ethnic groups, U.S. Latinos, African Americans, and Native Americans or Alaskan Natives, are disproportionately affected and have higher rates of PTSD than non-Latino whites do. So let's talk a little bit about the diagnosis of PTSD in the DSM-5. We need to have an exposure to an actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence in one or more of the following ways. That can be directly experiencing the traumatic event yourself, or witnessing in person the event as it happens to another person, or learning that the traumatic event occurred to a close family member or close friend. In the case of actual or threatened death of a family member or friend, the events must have been violent or accidental. And then experiencing repeated or extreme exposure to aversive details of the traumatic events, like first responders who are collecting human remains, police officers repeatedly exposed to details of child abuse, etc. But this fourth criteria does not apply if the exposure is only through electronic media, television, movies, or pictures, etc. You have to be directly involved. So that's important, right? Because again, I don't want to get on my soapbox, but I think that the word trauma gets thrown around a lot, and people use it as a label, an excuse, sometimes that something that they identify with as like, I'm a survivor of trauma. And I'm not saying that you're not, but some feel traumatized at the slightest exposure to something that's unpleasant. And that is not, in a medical sense, what we consider trauma or something that would be a criteria for developing PTSD. All right, so after that initial criteria is met, the person then has to have one or more of the following intrusive symptoms, which can be recurrent, involuntary, and intrusive distressing memories of the event, recurring distressing dreams of the event, dissociative reactions like flashbacks, intense or prolonged psychological distress at exposure to internal or external cues. For example, if you had a car accident and then you hear cars crashing, if that triggers you, and a marked physiological reaction to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble an aspect of the traumatic event. So again, the key there is that basically this memory or trigger of the memory is bringing up very easily in you an experience that feels like it did when you had the trauma. Then this next criteria is persistent avoidance of stimuli associated with the traumatic event. So avoidance of efforts to avoid distressing memories, thoughts, or feelings about or closely associated with the traumatic event, and avoidance of or efforts to avoid external reminders like people, places, conversations, activities, objects, situations. So when people have PTSD, they tend to just avoid as much as possible anything that would remind them of that. So, for example, a combat veteran with PTSD related to their combat trauma probably is not going to want to watch for entertainment a movie about a war. That's going to be because they're going to avoid that because they don't want to experience significant recurrence of those hardwired memories that are causing them to feel like they again need to act in a way to cause them to survive, even though they're not in danger right now. And then the third criteria is negative alterations in cognitions and mood associated with the traumatic events beginning or worsening after the traumatic event occurred, as evidenced by 2 or more of the following: inability to remember an important aspect of the event, persistent and exaggerated negative beliefs or expectations about oneself, others, or the world. For example, thinking, I'm bad, no one can be trusted, etc. Persistent distorted cognitions about the cause or consequences of the traumatic event that lead the individual to blame himself, herself, or others. Persistent negative emotional state like fear, horror, anger, guilt, or shame. Markedly diminished interest or participation in significant activities. Feelings of detachment or estrangement from others, persistent inability to experience positive emotions. So a lot of this sounds like depression, right? So basically withdrawal. Again, it's the emotional response that persists in a small percentage of people who go through a trauma where they're so overwhelmed that, again, in order to survive, they detach. Okay, so all of those are symptoms of that. And then finally, marked alterations in arousal and reactivity associated with the traumatic event. So this is reactivity, greater than expected reactivity, right? This can include irritable, angry outbursts, reckless or self-destructive behavior, hypervigilance, an exaggerated startle response, problems with concentration, and sleep disturbance. And the duration of these disturbances these are these 4 criteria that we just went through, is more than 1 month. So again, in the immediate aftermath of a trauma, it's common to experience any combination of those symptoms. But for most people, it will get better with time. If someone has persistence of those symptoms, that's when they might be diagnosed with PTSD. So what do we do as psychiatrists and therapists if someone has PTSD? The mainstay of treatment is therapy. We are talking about cognitive behavioral therapy. One of these ways of dealing with this is called exposure therapy. And essentially, the idea is that your brain is overly reactive to anything that reminds you of the situation that was threatening to you in the past. And that's a mistake now because now you're safe. So you work with your therapist to gradually recall and talk about and remember on purpose, even though you want to avoid it, the things that happened when you went through the trauma. And what that does is it helps you to integrate the experience and disconnect those initially hardwired responses. It's like, all right, has anyone ever had an experience where you ate something and then got violently ill? I had this happen when I was pregnant with my son. I ate some old, I think they were like Trader Joe's frozen stuffed mushrooms that I found at the back of my freezer. I don't know why. Weird pregnancy craving. They were like all frostbitten. I think this is what got me sick. Anyway, I remember I ate those and within hours, I was on the toilet and there were sounds coming out of the bathroom that led my husband to knock on the door and say, "Are you okay? It doesn't sound very good in there." I lost 6 pounds in 24 hours. I was so dehydrated. It was horrible. And I can tell you that that was traumatic in the sense that there was definitely a hard wiring in my brain that led me to want to avoid eating mushrooms for a long time afterwards. I'm not saying I had PTSD as a result of my food poisoning, but you get that idea. If you don't have PTSD and you're wondering, what does this feel like? If you've ever had really bad food poisoning, you know what it feels like. It's like that, I can't even look at a mushroom. I don't even want to think about it. I don't want to see people eating them. It just elicits all those feelings in you again, right? So that's what people with PTSD go through, although for them, it's obviously worse because it's truly a life-threatening event. And the intensity of their physical distress and emotional distress when they're triggered is greater than just that from vomiting, right? All right, so in exposure therapy, you basically are going to tell the story. You're going to let yourself feel those feelings. And in doing so in a safe place, you're gradually going to disconnect those hardwired neuronal connections and rewire in their place the fact that you can remember these things and talk about these things and feel safe, right? So again, it's neurological learning, but it's done in a way to decrease your symptomatology over time. There's something called EMDR, and this is a particular therapy where people watch a light going back and forth between the right and the left as they also talk about their trauma. And essentially, I think this works in a similar way to exposure-based therapy, but many people prefer it because A, it gives you something to focus on. So if you're talking about something that's very emotionally distressing, it helps to have to follow a light with your eyes because you're a little bit one step removed from that even when you're talking about it. It gives you something else to focus on. And then also the act of moving your eyes left to right is thought to facilitate connections between the left and right sides of the brain. And the left side of our brain is really where we process language and understanding. The right side of our brain is more the emotional side of our brain. So it helps us, again, to take that significant learning that happened on the emotional side of the brain, which was connected to all of those primitive survival pathways, and implement some kind of a down regulation of all of those things that can be driven by that by the left side of the brain that processes language and understands that right now you're safe. Many people with PTSD have nightmares, and there's something called imagery rehearsal therapy that can help people with nightmares to actually learn how to program themselves essentially to when they fall asleep and the nightmare starts to be able to realize they're in a dream, have lucid dreaming, and do whatever they want. Because in a dream, you have the power to do whatever you want. There's no reason that you have to be feeling unsafe and chased or in danger in your dreams. And this is really interesting to me. I have found it very interesting to read the stories of people who've learned imagery rehearsal therapy and they've had great benefits from it. Mindfulness, we're going to talk about more in a minute, but that also has great evidence basis. And I think really this is because of the spiritual connection and the ability to separate who you really are from the body that experienced that trauma. And finally, medications. As a psychiatrist, this was the mainstay of my role in treating someone with PTSD. Medications can definitely help symptoms. They can help insomnia. They can help emotional reactivity. They can help decrease the frequency of flashbacks if someone's experiencing those frequently. But ultimately, they don't solve the problem. They don't do anything to totally rewire the brain's networks that right now are faulty. And so I think we have to consider them when needed, but recognize that they're not the answer. And moreover, medications used in PTSD often have serious negative side effects. Weight gain, tardive dyskinesia, which is a movement disorder that often doesn't go away, sedation, cloudy thinking, reduced cognitive abilities, all of those things can happen with the medications that we commonly use in PTSD. All right, shifting gears, I want to talk next about the power of spirituality in PTSD especially. And as a psychiatrist, as the parent doctor, I think I'm a little bit unique because I do feel that we need to utilize more the connection that we all have to our understanding that we are not just our body or our thoughts. And we all know this, right? I'm not teaching you something that's really controversial. It's not something you believe or you don't believe. Like, oh, if you have a thought, that you are the observer of that thought. You may not have ever thought about this before, but we all know that we are also not our body. Like, I've been me for as long as I've been conscious. And that included a very young, tiny version of me when I was a kid. And it involves the 46-year-old version of me now. And if I'm lucky enough to live into old age, it will include that version of that body as well. So is that me? Am I limited to that body? No, right? I'm the person who's observing that body. I look in the mirror and I see this body, but that's not who I am. And it's also not who you are. Well, how does that relate to PTSD? Well, it relates because anything that happens to my body is also not happening to me. It's happening to my body, but that's not me. My true self is separate from my body and anything that happens to it. Now, this can feel a bit controversial. I was at a Tony Robbins event a couple years ago, and he was talking to a woman who had been raped, and she was identifying herself as a rape victim and a trauma victim. And he said to her, "When did you get raped?" And she said, whatever, 10 years ago in college. And he said, if it was more than 3 years ago, there's not a single atom in your body left from that experience. So why are you letting it impact you? And I thought, man, that's harsh. Like, I could never say that. As a psychiatrist, I couldn't imagine saying something like that to someone who was a victim of rape. And then I thought, well, but he's right. Our physical bodies, the atoms in our bodies are constantly changing and recirculating. We eat food, we breathe air, and things change. And why do we accept in psychiatry that someone can be permanently impacted and permanently altered by an event that happened years ago? It doesn't really make sense, right? And I think when we separate our awareness from our physical body, which includes our brain and its default mechanisms, which might be problematic, like in PTSD, then we can get more relief. And I think this is even something that kids can understand. If you think about playing a video game, there's the avatar or character in the video game, right? And then there's the person playing. And this is what I'm talking about. Like, the body that's going through life that might experience a trauma is equivalent in this analogy to the avatar in the video game. So Zelda, Mario, Kirby, whoever is like going through their little world. Things are happening. They're fighting bosses. They're getting bombs dropped on them, whatever. Swords stuck through them. They're dying and coming back to life. Okay, that's a little different than real life, but like, the body experiences trauma. We experience people telling us things, judging us, whatever it is. But that's not who we are. If we stop and realize, we can realize that we are not limited to that. We are separate from it. We're like the video game player. And this is where I really feel my training as a psychiatrist, even though I got specialty training in trauma from some excellent therapists and doctors at UCLA and at the West LA VA, with kids and with adults, I think it was really missing a big piece, which is this ability to help people see that you are not limited to your body and your brain. And I think when we can come at it from that distant perspective, which is really not distant, it's more connected to your true self. So if we can step back into our true self and realize that regardless of the fact that in PTSD, your body may respond when you smell a certain smell or hear a certain sound or hear someone's voice, you can remind yourself that you are okay, because the true self is untouchable and can't be traumatized. All right, so I hope that's helpful. I know it might be feeling a little controversial. I hope that I didn't make anyone feel that I'm saying PTSD doesn't exist. I know that it does exist, but it is a condition limited to the mind, the brain, and it can be treated. You can get relief from those automatic hardwired connections that sometimes result. The good news, though, is that most people who go through trauma do not experience persistent symptomatology that we would call PTSD. Most of us are pretty resilient to trauma. And I think the other important piece to remember is that most people experience trauma. It's not something that some minority of people experience. It's not something that makes you special. Most people experience trauma. So understand that's just part of being human. That's part of the experience of life. It doesn't mean that we have to let it define us or prevent us from doing the things that we want to do. And in fact, I would argue if you let PTSD, which is essentially like a form of anxiety, right? It's a inappropriate fear in the here and now about something that happened in the past. If we let anxiety dictate how we perform, what we do, what we choose to venture into, it robs the world of the gifts that we have to give. Anxiety is selfish. Anxiety prevents you from being able to serve the world and serve others in the way that your life is meant to do. So if you're experiencing symptoms of PTSD, you owe it to yourself, but you owe it to everyone. You owe it to your life to get over that, to get help to get over that, so that your brain's rewiring around this event can let go, so that you can get back to feeling like your true self, connect to that purpose that comes uniquely to you as your true self, and be able to live your life in the way that most honors that. And you deserve that. So I hope that you find it. I'm going to give you some resources today. As parents, I'm going to give you resources that are specifically to kids, but I'm also going to give you resources that are helpful for adults, recognizing that a large number of parents also may be experiencing trauma. As a child psychiatrist, I've seen so much trauma in so many ways, I can't even tell you, but it happens. I know that it happens. My heart is with you if you're going through something traumatic or difficult right now. And I also want you to know it will get better. It's just hard right now. All right, guys. Thank you for joining me today. Please tune in next week where I'm going to be talking about bipolar disorder. Take care. Bye.